Morning, Morris. Nice to see you here. So I'm Karen from Fashion Revolution Scotland, and we've created this short film in a bid to make it easier for very busy people to attend. So thank you to each of you who are here just now. And for this reason, we will not have formal introductions, but we'll just go straight to Bettina's presentation so that we can have more of a conversation after her short presentation. But just before we do that, I wonder if I could encourage us just to, sorry, I'm just sharing my screen, just to allow ourselves one moment to be fully present here, knowing that whatever's happened already this morning is now in the past and it won't be changed. It can be left behind us. And what's going to happen after this meeting will happen. So let's just leave it there in the future and bring attention to each other and to this moment and to the earth below our feet and the air within our bodies. Because today we don't think about what we do to nature, we recognize that we are nature. We're as much nature as any other creature or element. And we don't consider workers in faraway lands. We think of them as ourselves, that their working conditions are our working conditions. So today, what we are discussing is important. It shapes who we are becoming, and it can affect the impact that we have on the world. Thank you for being here. Katie, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce Bettina.
Thank you, Karen. That was a beautiful pocket of much needed peace and focus. Thank you. Bettina Heller is a Programme Officer in the United Nations Environment Programme's Consumption and Production Unit, where she coordinates the portfolios on eco-innovation and sustainable businesses. She has a focus on SMEs and on circularity in the textile value chain. Previously, Bettina's led projects in the area of consumer information, in particular around product sustainability, communication, eco-labelling, and product lifetime extension. Before joining the UN, Bettina worked in the area of green industry, and she has a Master in Global Studies and a Bachelor's degree in Cultural and Business Studies. We're so delighted you've joined us today. Thank you, Bettina. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be here today. I wish we would not have to be virtual, because looking at that beautiful picture, I just wish I could be in Scotland right now. But it's a pleasure to connect to you, and let me just start sharing my screen. I have a very short slideshow. I'll try not to spend too much time on this because I think the idea today is very much for us to also have a discussion. But I would just like to present to you some background on the research that we have done at UNEP around textiles. And this work started in 2019, actually. What I'm going to present to you comes from a research that we published in 2020. You can find a link here, but we can also share it in the chat. And the idea with this report for us was to really get the science right before we define sort of the priorities and the actions that we would need to take to move towards more sustainability and circularity in the textile value chain. And so this is a report is based on Hotspots analysis that was carried out for us, but also we had various stakeholder consultations and had a very good peer review that led into the findings of this report. We're actually at the moment working on the second, so to say, of this series of reports, which will be more forward-looking. So we call it a roadmap report because it's going to outline what needs to really happen in detail in that space and what is the role of each actor group. And of course, policymakers is one of our key actors. And I must say also one of the actors that in our consultations, a lot of the other players are looking towards too. So for instance, talking to manufacturers and producers, but also financial institutions or brands and retailers. It came up a lot that there is just so much interdependency of the actions that need to happen, and that policymakers are key, but I'm sure same the other way around, policymakers really need others to take action. So we're trying to tease out these interconnections and propose a roadmap ahead. But before we go into the future, let me just recap where we stand. So the textile value chain is comprised of different actors and stakeholders. The reason why at UNEP we talk about value chain as opposed to supply chain is that the value chain is a bit broader than the product life cycle. So of course, what you see here on screen is more the product life cycle. So we have the fiber production, then we go into yarn and fabric production, then the textile production and assembly. Finally, of course, we have the consumption phase and then the end of life. But when we talk about value chain, this also means all of the systems and values that shape that system. It includes the communities that are either deprived of value because, let's say, the waterways next to a factory are being polluted, but it also talks about those that receive value from the system because of employment, because of economic opportunities, and very importantly, it also includes the consumption patterns and business models that are part of the textile system. Our aspiration at UNEP is to shift towards a more circular system. So we have been trying to capture that in a graphic. So you can see the idea is to close the loop, but our overarching principle is that we should first of all try to reduce by design. So this is the sort of very outer loop you can see going into the other direction. And we always want to emphasize that it's very important to think about business models and to think about product design, because we really need to take these upstream measures. If we think, for instance, about a very downstream circular process of recycling, this is made impossible if there are certain chemicals of concern in the product, for instance, and the decision of which chemicals go into the product and which functions that product needs to fulfill are really taken at the design stage, at the conception stage, very much upstream. So this is why we are saying we should really first take this holistic and upstream view, and then we can look at all the other loops that are possible. Apart from sort of the recycling one, there are others such as refuse and reduce, which is more at the point of the consumer, repurposing of textiles, but also reusing and repairing. Now, I just wanted to quickly show the geographical breakdown of global apparel production. We don't have to go too much into detail here. And of course, for our report, we focused on one specific fiber mix. So this will vary a bit depending on the boundary conditions you have for your research. But in general, we can see that with rising value of the product, the global value chain, the global share of value diversifies. So essentially, the stages that have the lower value add are mostly taking place in developing countries, mostly in Asia. And those are also the regions that have the weakest sort of social protection system in place, and where there's sort of this the low prices and low wages that are being paid. Whereas then the later stages where there's more value add, they are usually owned by major players, by big brands and others that are based mostly in Europe and North America. In terms of environmental hotspots, so the report goes into much more detail. I invite you to read it if you want to find out more for each of these pillars, but this is just a summary. So we are structuring it around climate, nature, and pollution including also very importantly chemicals. So if we look at the beginning of the value chain, the fiber production stage, we can see a hotspot. So a hotspot means this is the most important impact in that phase. There will be other impacts, but they're just not the most important. That's why we don't mention them all. So in the natural fibers, this is mostly due to cotton production. And here we see a high use of agrochemicals, so pesticides and fertilizers. And also cotton production has a big land use footprint, and therefore can also affect biodiversity. And there is high water usage in the cultivation of cotton. On the other side, from synthetic fibers, we see a high climate footprint at that stage, simply because synthetic fibers are made from fossil fuels. And I quite like this part of the picture because it also shows that it's not necessarily the solution to just shift from one material to the other, because every material will have an impact and there's always going to be trade-offs. So what we just need to do is to get the research behind all the materials right, and then make sure we take informed decisions. Because just saying we're going to completely phase out one material and then shift 100% more to another material might then really cause an uneven balance also in the value chain. For yarn and fabric production, we have not identified any specific hotspots, though of course there are also important impacts in that stage, but I will not go into detail. For textile production, most of the high impacts come from the wet processing phase, so that's the bleaching, dyeing, and finishing of the textile product. And here we have the highest climate footprint, which is due to the energy that is needed to heat the water for the wet finishing process. And usually this is done in countries that rely more on coal-based energy. At the same time, we have a high chemical and water pollution because of the chemicals that are used for the bleaching, dyeing, and finishing. And in this phase, also from synthetic materials, we have a high microfiber release into the environment. Then for the consumption phase, it's actually the phase that has the second highest impact on climate, which is interesting. It's due to the washing behavior of the consumer, essentially. This varies very much by region, by country, by culture, because there are some regions that are more used to cold wash and line drying. So for them, this will show much lower. And then other countries where people are more used to really doing hot wash cycles and also using tumble dryers more, the climate footprint will go up, again, depending on the energy mix that the country uses, of course. And also here we have an issue of microfiber release in that stage. For the end of life, the actual impact that we can measure from a life cycle assessment perspective is rather low. It's actually negligible. However, we should not forget the high value loss that we have by textile products not being utilized enough and even being destroyed or burned without use, because of course all of these impacts that already went into creating the product in the first place are then lost. So one of our key recommendations is to make sure that products are utilized more and that they are being used longer, so that in the end we can also, so to say, decrease the size of the entire loop and utilize it more. For social hotspots, again, I don't want to go into too much details, but of course we know that the textile sector has also very high social issues. Actually, this was much more discussed even before the environmental issues. And as I said, we can see many of those occurring in the weaker parts of the value chain that also have the lower value add from the system. Usually those are around working hours, wages, gender-related conditions, unsafe working conditions, and involuntary and informal labor. You can see on the screen sort of the outline of how these are affected in different stages. Again, here also important to think about the chemical use, because this is posing also a risk to the workers, but also the communities that live around the factories. I want to finish with some key needs and priority actions that we have identified. So I think for today that the first one is most important, but I want to mention all of them, of course. So one thing that we heard back from our consultations and that keeps on coming back in a lot of meetings is that there is a need for stronger governance and policies in the space. So there are quite a few sort of voluntary initiatives already driven by, let's say, those that are more motivated or more advanced in the industry, but progress has been rather slow. So one of the really transformative actions that we see is that there is more regulation and policies to set the level playing field in that space. And this would be a actions or priorities that we recommend for policymakers are to really consult and coordinate key stakeholders to set ambitious policy, so that involves stakeholders at sort of the local level within the ministries across the government, but then for textiles, because it is such a global value chain, this also involves, of course, other countries and trying to come up with a policy that then works across countries. Then it's about providing a predictable and clearly enforced policy environment. and considering impacts beyond own borders, I think reflects sort of what I was saying before. And just a few examples. So for instance, we have found that it would be good to incentivize new innovative business models that increase textile utilization and reduce consumption. For instance, through fiscal policies, through sustainable public procurement, because if the government starts buying those products first, it sort of creates a market for that. Also through regulations. There can be implementation of eco-design requirements, which again sort of sets a benchmark for the industry to work towards, and also production standards to level the playing field, and many others. In another priority we have identified, or a gap, is that there needs to be more done around collaboration and finance. So we speak a lot about these new business models that need to pick up more strongly. So such as, let's say, rental or sharing or repairing. But actually, we are not yet at a stage where we can really scale those business models. And often financing is missing for those that are weaker, let's say, in the value chain. So for instance, the small and medium enterprises in the developing countries that also need to implement those changes. But also more research needs to be done around solutions and technologies. For the funding, one priority we have identified is again also to really work with financial institutions to make sure that funding can be de-risked and that also SMEs can receive the funding that they need to make those changes. Here we also have a point for government collaboration, because what we heard back from other governments is that it would be good to have a space where all the policymakers can come together and actually also discuss this issue. And of course, at EU level, you will have seen the release of the textile strategy very recently. So this is already going into that direction at that level. And the third one, not to forget, is changes in consumption habits. So of course, we always talk about these new business models we need, but a preempt to that is that we first need consumers to also have an interest in those. We have to have consumers that want to keep their products longer, that think it is cool to repair a t-shirt. So also this whole sort of cultural and society dimension behind it has to be considered. And this might be the most difficult piece of the puzzle. So it's about changing consumer attitudes and setting new aspirations, building acceptance for a product longevity, and so on. But also here a point about garment care. So we've seen one of the highest climate footprints is actually in garment care. So by providing clear instructions to consumers, we can also really reduce what's happening in that stage. And I'll finish just by saying all of this needs accountability, and a sort of cross-cutting need is transparency and traceability in this very complex and not very transparent value chain. So there are other UN agencies also already working on this. Happy to share a bit more if you're interested. But maybe I'll stop here so that we can go to the discussion.
Wow, Bettina, thank you so much. I wonder if you might stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, let me try to. Oh yeah, here it is.
Fantastic. So much to consider there, so much so succinctly put forward in such a short space of time, but unpacking that obviously will take a long time, but we know that needs to start now. It should have started a long time ago. So I'm just going to open the floor for questions. So please do ask Bettina whatever you would like. We only have 20 minutes for this discussion, so it's important that we start straight away. Go, Morris.
Hi, Bettina. I'm just probably the thrust of my question is how we ensure that government intervention can improve. I muted myself by accident there. Yeah, how we ensure that government intervention can improve the carbon footprint of our value chain. So, I mean, you've touched on elements of this, but both from at the start, how we can encourage more sustainable fibers going into our textiles, you know, whether that be nettle farming, then how we ensure that our business models that facilitate our use of garments, things like mud jeans. I looked at buying them, but by the time you do the packaging, postage and packaging, then it doesn't work. So it sounds like we need the mud jeans for everything here. And finally, and governments generally aren't so good at this, how do we actually change consumer behavior in terms of both washing, but also buying clothes as well? So sorry, an all-encompassing opener for me.
Thanks for the question. And yeah, it's a tough one to answer in a short space of time. And I'm laughing because essentially you've a bit summarized what our upcoming report is trying to do in 50 pages. But just to give some ideas, I mean, I think, first of all, as you said correctly, it's really important to look at it, to do some research and base that on data, or maybe, I mean, there's so much happening in that space actually that it might also just be doing a mapping of the research that is already happening in Scotland, but also beyond, because there might already be something you can refer to. But yeah, it's important to not have any trade-offs and not say, okay, we go for the solution, but then, actually, I don't know, we need to send things, ship them back and forth, and we're actually going to increase our footprint in the end. I think at what you said about the fiber production, for instance, potential measures could be to look into stimulating sustainable design that can start at education. So if there's sort of fashion design schools in Scotland that could integrate that into their curriculum, for instance, maybe also sharing again lessons across the different regions, also seeing what sort of the possibility. I guess what could be useful is maybe a mapping of where actually most of the products that are being consumed in Scotland come from, where they are being produced, so you can sort of pinpoint the main regions. We find in general data is really hard to access for the textile sector, but what's easier to access is trade-related data, so that can maybe be something to start looking into. And then when it comes to the more of the consumption phase, it's really about yeah, I think at government level, you can think about campaigns to really educate sort of the general public and work together with them to pinpoint those solutions. What we found, we're working on another sort of mini report, which is going to be a playbook on how to communicate sustainable fashion to consumers. And one of the points we make in there is that it's important to really draw a positive picture and focus on solutions, because a lot of what we've seen so far was always very much, this is an evil sector, there are so many bad impacts, but just saying that and not providing the concrete solutions to the consumers also will not work. So maybe also working with influencers or others and sort of highlighting how can you consume more sustainable when it comes to fashion. And about the climate footprint, I mean, if we only look at the use phase and, for instance, the washing, it could even be working with the white goods industry, seeing if there can be standards set that, for instance, cold wash is the default that will come up in the machine, and then actually the person needs to change if it's warmer wash. So little things like that could also be an entry point to start with. Sorry, I don't know if that did not answer all of your questions, but I just gave a few ideas.
Maurice, does that answer, or is there anything else that you would like to bring into that conversation?
No, I think that's really interesting. Thanks, Bettina. I mean, I think there's got to be a role for perhaps the finance sector in allowing consumers to access higher value but durable goods. And even, when I was speaking on the kind of the washing cycle, Procter & Gamble produce an entirely different washing product for Eastern Europe and in Russia, because they are commonly, I think you touched on this, Bettina, they commonly use colder washes. So actually they get a better washing powder because it has to operate at colder temperatures. And I just wondered if there's any conversations both with the finance sector and with, the washing powder guys and girls to try and engage them to influence consumer behavior as well.
So So there might be, I must say, I don't know, but I could imagine, and it's a really good idea. I know that there are actually sort of from the washing powder producers, there have been some campaigns that they've been running in the past. And there's also increasingly a number of brands that in their internal KPIs, they actually put sort of the use phase of the consumer under their responsibility. So they actually have KPIs where they measure how do our consumers then wash our clothes, and how can we sort of work to not influence, but to stimulate them to take the best action there. I'm not sure about the financial institutions. I'll see if I can find out more, but it's an interesting idea. And just because you mentioned financial institutions, I mean, maybe I can give you a bit more of an overview of what the structure that we have in our upcoming roadmap report, because we actually look into different stakeholder groups there. So we are looking into brands and retailers and their roles, then further up the chain into raw material producers and manufacturers. We have a section on innovators and recyclers. So those, not only those at end of life, but also those that are sort of putting forward innovative new materials, innovative new business models, and so on. Of course, policymakers, and then financial institutions is one of the groups that we also provide recommendations for. And then we have a final one that is a bit of a mixed group that constitutes communication and consumer engagement actors. So that could be brands, governments, marketing agencies, influencers, basically anyone who communicates with consumers. And in terms of sort of the priorities that are the clusters under which we are parking priorities that we see, we have three. So one is around shifting consumption patterns and business models. So that's a lot of what we've just been discussing. Then there is something about improving practices. So this goes also more into what's happening at the production phase and in the production countries around, for instance, elimination of production pollution through new technologies, through change of processes, but also the just transition, because that's another element that's maybe very important for policymakers to consider, is if we move to a system where, for instance, we'll move away from certain practices, or we'll have products that are being used longer, but what does that mean for jobs in certain regions, and how will that change, and how do we also need to preempt that and already put sort of measures into place so that people can be employed elsewhere, etc. And the third sort of big cluster is around infrastructure development and investment. And this is an interesting one because it doesn't only concern the textile sector, of course, but you've seen a lot of the measures are around, we have a high climate impact because coal-based energy is being used. So that would then link to also having access to renewable energy grids infrastructure in those countries and so on. And of course, this is nothing that a government only plans for the textile sector. It goes a bit wider. But those are sort of the clusters that we've identified.
Thanks, Bettina. Yes, Mary Beth.
Hi, Bettina. Thank you. This report we were talking about how incredibly, like, it's just full of all of the parts of the puzzle that we have all been trying to work towards covering over the last few years. I wanted to ask more on the social hotspots that are identified in the report. Kind of where Fashion Revolution originally came from was very much focusing on the people that make our clothes, and my kind of short research background's to do with human rights in the supply chain. And I just wanted to kind of dig a wee bit into that with you and see if what we seem to have found with loads to do with marrying international human rights law with the complexity of these supply chains is that it becomes far too nuanced, it becomes far too dependent on culture, on domestic policy, on trying to bridge that across multiple different states. We've not quite found proper answers yet, whereas on the environmental side of things, I find that there's a lot more practical and quite logical solutions that we find and that we can go and seek out through research, etc. So I think what I would love to know is the environmental programme going to work in partnership with existing bodies like the Business and Human Rights, the working group over there, or with the ILO, in terms of covering that aspect of this project? And will the roadmap kind of look towards a more international approach to how to mend those human rights issues within the supply chains, which are so prevalent?
Thanks so much for the question. Also really interesting, and great to learn you've done more research on that already. Yeah, indeed, it's interesting because it's an issue that sort of came up before environment, but yeah, as you say, there are not so many solutions yet. So we are working very closely actually with ILO. I mean, we always say we are not the specialists on the social side, but for us, maybe I should also clarify that for us, when we talk about circularity, we really mean circularity and considering in a sustainable consumption and production system. So it always involves all three pillars of sustainability. And this is also why we always talk about this rather wordy terminology of sustainability and circularity in the textile value chain, because we want to make sure that we don't only talk about that from an environmental perspective, but that the social aspects and the people around it are as important. So it's also, I feel, the environmental solutions that are being proposed today also need to consider that. So I talked about trade-offs more from an environmental side. So for instance, I don't know, switching to cotton instead of synthetics, we might have an increase in pesticides, but it also goes between the pillars, right? So we have to make sure that we don't switch to something that is maybe a good solution on the environmental side, but then will put many people out of a job or make products so expensive that certain parts of population can no longer afford them, and so on. So all of this around the just transition also a bit. I also wanted to refer to BSR. I don't know if you've been following their research, but they've actually been running research on sort of what does it mean to go more circular in countries, and what are the reskilling needs of workers in that space, and how can we work? I think they also have recommendations for governments and policymakers, how they can support that space. And yeah, in our roadmap, we are also looking around solutions there. I think it's very much interconnected, because if you think about new business models, those will automatically also transform the social aspect. So let's say we want to increase the utility and longevity of products. That means we will have to work with suppliers that can create materials that are more durable and that can, I don't know, withstand more washing cycles, and that might need a different technology at the stage of the supplier, and that might come with the reskilling of the worker who will actually then be handling that technology on the ground. So all of this needs to be preempted. So one thing that we think would be quite useful is to do sort of more research and case studies around how can these business models look like in practice, and what does it mean. And maybe one more thing to mention to you, we currently have a call for proposals open. I think it's closing this week, but happy to share also that with you afterwards. And this is following a request that we received from member states at the United Nations Environment Assembly 2 years ago. And this was in the resolution on sustainable consumption production. And essentially, the idea is to assess what does it mean to go circular in certain sectors, and we are running that in the textile sector. So, for instance, if I'm just making things up, but if 60% of the products are now being recycled, or if the repair model becomes more popular and that replaces sort of the purchasing of new textiles by that much, then what does that mean in terms of environmental impact reduction, but also what does it mean in terms of social issues? So in terms of job loss, new jobs created, where are those, what kind of needs does that come with? But it's a massive project because it requires a lot of data, and there is really a lack of data. So we are thinking that this will take probably the next 1.5 years or so, but happy to also keep you updated on that research.
Thank you, Bettina. That's really helpful. Andre.
Hi, thank you. My name is Andrei Ninkovic. I'm here on behalf of Faisal Chowdhury, MSP. As you kind of touched on it in your key needs, the upstream view that you mentioned earlier would seem to require the cooperation of lots more stakeholders, including global stakeholders, than just focusing on the consumption or the early life phase of the value chain. How successful has that been so far, and what are the best ways of approaching it?
So I would say it's been successful in certain issue areas. So there are initiatives that look at specific pieces of the puzzle. So for instance, you have the charter from the UNFCCC that looks really at the climate impacts and brings together sort of industry leaders around that, and then looks at the textile and fiber production and what can be done at that space. You have the Fashion Pact. I don't know if you're aware of that group, but that's also a sort of industry leaders that have come together to shift the needle that was announced at the G7 when France held the presidency. And here they are, for instance, looking at also very specific stages of the value chain and trying to bring all the players together on the ground. What we see is that a lot of these conversations have happened more about what we would call sort of traditional sustainability. So things like phasing out of chemicals of concern or working to treat water pollution, for instance, and wastewater. We see a gap really when it comes to the circularity space and having this more holistic view that you just said. So we feel more can be done. There are a few organizations that are engaging in that space. What we also find is that a lot of the engagement is happening at sort of developed country level. A lot is driven by European countries and North America. But we feel there's more need to bring also the other countries around the table. Maybe I can mention one project that UNEP is currently running that could maybe be of interest just to see sort of how it can work also on the ground. So we are running a project that's funded by European Union called INTEX. It's the short title, so I'll spare you the long one. But it's around sort of sustainable business models and also analysis in the textile sector. We have global components, so that long research project I just mentioned is actually part of that project. But we are also working in Kenya, South Africa, and Tunisia. And here the approach is to work with SMEs in those countries to analyze their product environmental footprints. I'm not sure if you're following that methodology that is currently developed at EU level, but the idea is to really be able to compare the footprint of products between different products. So it's sort of a very robust methodology that is being developed, and we are sort of piloting if this can also be applied by the SMEs in those 3 countries in Africa. And at the same time, we're working with them on eco-innovation, which helps those businesses to analyze at my business level, where do my hotspots lie, who do I work with in the value chain, and how can I propose more sustainable business models to drive that change. And it's quite interesting because it's really a difference between countries. For instance, Tunisia, we're almost exclusively working with SMEs that are suppliers to European companies. So for them, the business case is very clear. We have to increase the standards so that we can continue to export and be sort of a leader in that field. Whereas, for instance, in Kenya, it's also a lot about still building up the local textile industry and sort of leapfrogging. So to make sure that those SMEs that are developing from the beginning, they will have those standards in place and so on. Sorry, that was another very long answer, but we can also share the link to that project in the chat. And we're just starting to work with the SMEs now, but I'm happy to share more lessons learned as we go forward.
Thank you, Bettina, and thank you, Martina, for sharing those links, much appreciated. And I would encourage everyone to save their chats. Remember to do that so you've got access to all of those. We're coming to the end of our question time, but I'm aware that someone might just have a burning question. So I'm just going to allow a few more minutes for that. Nikki, you're on mute.
That old classic. Thank you so much, Bettina, for sharing this report with us today. Yeah, I work in education currently and have a vast experience within the industry as a designer within buying teams. And I'm wondering if on the roadmap, how do you look at the labelling? Because we know like with food industry, you know, it's very clear, we have percentages of the chemicals and everything that's in, and it's a conversation that we have quite a lot at Fashion Revolution, because obviously we know that transparency is really important and how it can help educate citizens. Yeah, and I just wondered if you had done any work around the labelling and how, I mean, I know we need probably government support to kind of ensure that labelling within the fashion industry is clearer, and that, because I think, you know, working in the fashion industry as a designer, all you need to put is one country of origin and one material or two materials. But obviously we know we're not letting people know about all the chemicals that are in our materials. And I feel like if there was a sort of full labelling sort of within what we buy, we could be helping to create more value and for citizens to make better choices on what they're buying.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. It's a really good point, and it's something that comes up a lot, this whole issue also of transparency and traceability again, but on both sides, because it's both for sort of even the companies to know who are my suppliers beyond sort of the first or second tier, but then also for the consumers to take the informed decisions. So in general, in the roadmap, our recommendation is that labeling is one piece of the puzzle, so that we cannot rely only on that, because of course, not every consumer will look for that information. So it's really important to start first with sort of awareness raising, campaigning, really changing the consumption patterns and the aspirations of people and what they want from a textile product. But then when it comes to the actual purchase decision, then labeling plays a really important role. And also, as you said, for sort of tracing the chain and looking back. I think actually the work around the product environmental footprint that I've mentioned, the methodology from the European Union, we do not yet know what the policy implications from that will be, because at the moment it's more of the development at sort of the research level, but that is the goal, is to also have one methodology that then creates a bit more uniformity maybe between sort of also different labeling systems, because there's sort of one standard and one way to get data and share data. In terms of, there is another project that might be relevant that is run by UNEP, the Economic Commission for Europe, together with the International Trade Center. And they are actually looking at transparency and traceability in the textile value chain. And they are also exploring other tools such as blockchain and running a few pilots to see could those new technologies be leveraged to basically have a better traceability. And of course, with the end goal to then again have good information that can be passed on to the consumer. So yeah, I think those are maybe resources to look at. And we do have certainly a few recommendations around labeling also in our report. So it is a really important one to look at.
Thank you. I think just seeing such a rise in greenwashing, it feels like we need to kind of have greater kind of knowledge about the materials and the places where we're kind of making our clothes. Thanks.
Yeah, indeed.
Bettina, your wealth of knowledge is fantastic and such a gift to us. Thank you for sharing. Is there anyone else has a burning question? I also noticed that Katie, you put a question in the chat. Would you like to raise that?
Oh, yes, thank you, Karen. Bettina, you might have already covered it, but you'd mentioned that governments are quite keen to have a kind of a forum for policymakers to come together. Is that something that the UNEP would facilitate? And is it something that we could ask for the Scottish Government to become involved in?
So it is definitely something we're discussing because there are so many requests around this. For us, the first step is first to finalize our report now. So we will launch that in the coming months, and I'll certainly keep you updated on that. But definitely, and we would actually love to hear back also more from countries on where they see the need and what kind of support that they would require. So if anyone in the room or afterwards in the discussions you are going to have, if you would like to touch base more on this with us and inform us what specific support you would be requiring, that would be really good for us to know.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Last opportunity to ask any questions. Paul? Paul, you're on mute. Oh no, you're not. I just can't hear you. Sorry.
In my experience, sometimes when you take out the headset, it works.
Maybe take your headset out, Paul. Would that work? Oh,
there
you go.
Is that coming across? There we go. Sorry about that. The old earphones playing up. I think it was touched upon earlier. I just wondered if you had any examples of where we should be looking at for best practice in more developed countries in terms of government intervention. Is there any at national level or even sort of sub-national level? Is there anyone doing anything that you know, perhaps we should be taking a lead from at present?
Yeah, good question. And I can maybe also email more details about that to Karen, who can then spread it with the group. But there's quite a lot happening actually in European countries. So for instance, the Netherlands, they have a very comprehensive sort of circularity package around textiles. They've also done some work, for instance, around public procurement, especially I think it was uniforms for firefighters and other things. I think Sweden is quite active in the space of sort of incubators that can support businesses that are innovating, but also in campaigning and really trying to inform the public around this. Switzerland, for instance, also has a sort of, I think it's a 2050 vision and strategy around sustainable textiles. And if you have not yet consulted that, I would also invite you to read the EU strategy for sustainable textiles, because it's very comprehensive in terms of sort of the different policy options, and not all will apply to everyone, but it could be just for inspiration, a good document to look at. So I can email sort of more of these, and I don't know if it was visible on my slide before because I went really quick, but we actually at UNEP, we are conveying a sort of expert community around that topic. So that just started with a few people from our workshops who wanted to stay in touch, and now it's a mailing list with over 600 people, and we have a monthly newsletter where we're just trying to, it's not, we're not covering everything that's happening in the space, but we're just picking up whatever comes towards us from members of that community, and we're trying to share it back. So anyone who wants to sign up, you can actually write to my colleague Martina, who's been posting in the chat. Martina, maybe you can leave your email address, and she's going to add you. But also, if your plans shape up for what's happening in Scotland, we'd be really happy to share it with the group. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is that all these countries that I've mentioned, they are also part of our expert community. So if you say, you know, we would love to talk to somebody from the Netherlands and exchange on what they've been doing, we're really happy to make those connections, for instance.
That's super. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for asking that question, Paul. My heart's positively bursting with the opportunities that you're mentioning, Bettina. I'm sorry we've gone slightly over our 45 minutes, but everything that we've discussed has been so important. And I'd like to just finish with introducing the Fashion Revolution Scotland National Coordinator, Mary Beth Graham, who's just taken on that role in the last few months. And Mary Beth is just going to outline how we see Fashion Revolution Scotland going forward in the rest of 2022. Mary Beth, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Bettina, again. I'm just going to quickly share my screen with you all, and I will be quick with this. So we took the report and we pulled it all apart and really delved into it, and feel like what I said earlier on, Bettina, it really summarises so much of the work that we've been wanting to do, and it articulates it in a really, really clear way and in a really all-encompassing way. So the policy group over the last few years have been doing an incredible amount of work, our policy sub-team within Fashion Revolution Scotland, with these conversations with ministers. And we had a conversation about how do we marry these two things that are going on, this brilliant relationship, an opportunity that we've had to speak with you, Bettina, and to really delve into this work that the programme are doing, and how do we take this forward in our own space. So we've come up with this idea to launch a programme for change, where we will look to frame the work that you have been developing and talking through today on a Scottish level. And we will look to use our resources here, our developed relationships that we have already, and gather those stakeholders in Scotland to create significant system change together. So how we kind of see this working, and this is very, very high level, we're still in the total, like, this is just born phase. The initial one is getting a total wish list of those key stakeholder groups, and these are identified in the report, but then looking at how that applies and translates into our Scottish communities here and the landscape that is here already, both politically and creatively, and then pulling out those specialists and those thought leaders within those spaces until we can almost create a round table with heads that represent each different space. Then what we'll be looking to do is, when the roadmap comes out in the next few months, we are really, really looking forward to that, and looking forward to the practical suggestions that are going to come through on that. So there'll be a lot of working with the report that is currently just now and the roadmap that will come, and all going away and evaluating that, seeing how we can apply it to Scotland in terms of political, the political field, what ministers is it that we've got engaged already, who is it that we need to engage, where does this sit on the political sphere, and is there relationships that really need built there socially. And I think that marries in with the cultural thing to do with how are we going to communicate that, what do citizens need, what education do we need to increase, what do we need to increase accessibility to, what do we need to make more understandable, and looking at economic, which I think here in Scotland is a really, really interesting one, because we've got a really wide array of economic access to the sustainability message. And one thing that the Fashion Revolution team here are very passionate about doing is building through those barriers and ensuring that people of all backgrounds have access to be doing their bit for both the planet and for other people. So then bringing that all back together, collaborating on that to build a really practical vision that can be proposed, whether that's proposed to policymakers who hopefully would have been involved from the beginning, but pulling all of that together and pulling out those system changes that we're wanting to call for, and then looking at, right, well, how do we lay the groundwork to actually make this happen? How do we turn these really encouraging conversations that have been going on and this sort of bubbling hope and ambition for a better way forward here in Scotland? How do we create that to become a reality? How do we bring Scotland to the forefront of best practice, like what we've been discussing, and hopefully at one point have Scotland in that mix that you just referenced there. And so that's how we see this going forward. We're hoping, we've yet to discuss the sort of practicalities of it. We would look for it being maybe meetings every second month, really keeping that ball rolling, and keeping everyone in touch and updated with it. But it was just to sort of give an insight into how we see this, that this isn't just a one-off sort of brilliant conversation, that we're really hoping to grasp onto this and move forward with it. And hopefully, Bettina, we can stay in touch and gather support along the way. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mary Beth, so much. That we've come to the end. Apologies again for being slightly over the 45 minutes, but we have kept under an hour, which was our main aim. I'd just like you to all unmute and say goodbye to each other. If there's any other conversations you want to have, then have them now.
I just wanted to really thank you for the invitation, and just to say it's great to see how things are moving, and of course we're very happy to stay in touch, and we'll look forward to watching how things progress. Thanks so much.
Bettina, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful for your time and for your expertise. And as Mary Beth just said, we do hope that this is the beginning of a much bigger conversation for Scotland and for each of us here. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Bettina.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.